Okay, so moving on to section 3 of chapter 18, we're going to kind of do the pathway of blood flow from one atrium to the ventricle, to the lungs, to our body, and so on and so forth. So what this pathway is showing you is that if we were to follow like a single erythrocyte in our body, follow its pathway all the way through. In reality, I do want you to keep in mind that when the right atria contracts, so does the left. And when the right ventricle contracts, so does the left ventricle. So even though they're considered two separate pumps, they're pumping at the same time. But we're just going to follow the pathway at one point. So let's start with the right side of the heart. The right atrium is receiving low-level oxygenated blood that's being returned from our body tissues. It's low-level oxygenation because our tissues needed the oxygen, so it was dropped off there, and now we don't have as much oxygen, and we have to send it back to our heart to pick up more. So what's bringing blood to our right atrium, again, is our superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and our coronary sinus. So now we're filling our right atrium from these three different sources. Once it's in our right atrium, eventually it's going to fill to the point where our right atria is going to contract, causing the blood to be pushed through our tricuspid valve. Once it's pushed through our tricuspid valve, it's going to be entering into our right ventricle. Our right ventricle is going to continue to fill until our right ventricle contracts. Once our right ventricle contracts, it's going to push the blood through our pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. Once it's in our pulmonary trunk, that low-level oxygenated blood is going to be carried to the pulmonary arteries and eventually our lungs, which are going to replenish the oxygen in our erythrocytes. So after we've replenished the oxygen in our erythrocytes, we send from our lungs the high-level oxygenated blood back to the left side of our heart. So there's 4 different sources that are sending this high-level oxygenated blood back to the left atrium. So that's accomplished via the 4 pulmonary veins, 2 right pulmonary veins, 2 left pulmonary veins that are dumping this blood into the left atrium. Once our left atrium fills and it contracts, it's going to push the blood through the mitral valve and into our left ventricle. And then our left ventricle, once it's full, is going to contract and then push the blood through our aortic semilunar valve to our aorta, which is going to eventually disperse it to all of our body tissues as it goes through systemic circulation. So definitely make sure you understand the pathway of blood flow. Also, when we're talking about the chambers of the heart and the aorta, superior, inferior vena cava, pulmonary veins, things like that, also be aware of which ones are carrying heavily oxygenated blood and which ones are carrying or holding low-level oxygenated blood. So here's a really good illustration. So again, here's our right atrium here, and it's receiving the low-level oxygenated blood, which is why it's colored blue. So when we're talking about blue and red coloring in this textbook, it's referring to the level of oxygenation of the blood, not to whether or not it's a vein or an artery. So we have the low-level oxygenated blood filling our right atrium. Eventually our right atrium is going to contract and push the blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Once our right ventricle contracts, it's going to push the blood through our semilunar valve, which is right here, into our pulmonary trunk. And again, this is oxygen poor blood because it's coming back from our body tissues. So it's entering the pulmonary trunk so that we can transport eventually to our lungs where we can pick up more oxygen. So after it reaches our lungs, now we are carrying oxygen-rich blood. So the 4 pulmonary veins that are returning the blood back to our heart, these are carrying oxygen-rich blood. And they're going to dump this blood into the left atrium, which is right here. Our left atrium is going to empty into our left ventricle via the mitral valve. Our left ventricle is going to contract, push blood through our aortic or semilunar valve, and eventually out to our aorta, where we're going to supply all of our body tissues with this heavily oxygenated blood. And then we start the process all over again. So a couple other things to think about, even though we're dealing with 4 separate chambers, they're not completely unique. So we have equal volumes of blood that are being pumped in both our pulmonary and our systemic circuits. Even though it seems like our systemic circuit is much larger, they are holding the same amount of blood. Also, when we're talking about the 2 different circuits, the pulmonary circuit is much shorter, so we don't need to have as much pressure in order to propel the blood through that circuit. So it's a low pressure circulation. Our systemic, however, is much longer and larger, so we do need to have a lot more pressure going through because it's so much longer. That means it's going to have higher friction that it's having to deal with as it travels through our body. So because of these differences and the need of the pressure that we create in each ventricle, the anatomy is also going to reflect that. So the left ventricle walls are about 3 times thicker and larger than that of the right, because the left ventricle is the one that needs to pump the blood to the aorta that's going to send it to all of our tissues. So we need more muscle for a stronger contraction, so a thicker wall, in order to propel it all the way through our body. Our right ventricle doesn't need as much because when it contracts, it's just sending the blood to our pulmonary circuit, which again is short and low pressure. So here's a good image showing you the difference. So we have our left ventricle, and this is the myocardium right here. So this is a layer, and we can see how thick this layer is for our left ventricle. But our right ventricle, in contrast, look how thick this layer is. And again, because we don't need to generate as much pressure because it's going to the pulmonary circuit. The last thing in this section we need to talk about is the coronary circulation. So remember I mentioned that the blood needs its own supply. So even though the heart muscle is holding all of this blood, it can't actually utilize the blood that it's holding. So it needs its own circulation system to actually provide the nutrients needed to the heart muscle tissue itself. And that blood supply is called the coronary circulation itself. That's how it gets its own nutrients. So it's the shortest circulation in the body. Why? Because again, it's only supplying the heart itself, so which is not a super large organ. And it's delivered to the heart when the heart is relaxed. So during contraction, it's not able to receive any of this blood, but during relaxation, the coronary arteries are allowing blood flow to happen and for nutrient exchange to occur. Again, if we're thinking about the anatomical differences between the 4 chambers, because the left ventricle is so much thicker and so much larger, we would expect that the left ventricle is actually going to receive the majority of the coronary blood supply. So coronary arteries, we have left and right coronary arteries, and they're all going to arise from the base of the aorta. So when the aorta receives blood, the aorta is going to send some of this blood to the left and to the right coronary arteries to help to supply the heart itself. Both of these arteries, the left and the right, are going to basically go around in a circle in the heart, and where they go around is what we call the coronary sulcus. From these coronary arteries, both the left and right, there's also some branching that occurs. You may need to know the name of these for lab, but for lecture, I'm not focused on the names of these branch portions of the coronary arteries. And if we're talking about the heart itself, it's going to receive about a 20th of the entire blood supply because this is a very heavily needed nutrient tissue. So left coronary artery, this is going to help supply the interventricular septum. The interventricular septum is basically the attachment between both ventricles. So interventricular septum, so right in between those two. Also the anterior ventricular walls, left atrium, posterior wall of the left ventricle. And it also has two branches. Again, you don't need to identify the location of these for lecture, but for lab you might. So we have our anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. Our right coronary artery is going to supply mainly, well, our right atrium and most of the right ventricle. It also has two branches, and one of them is the right marginal artery, and the second one's the posterior interventricular artery. Okay, so cardiac veins. So these are going to be collecting the blood from the capillary beds, and the veins join to form eventually the coronary sinus that's dumping the blood into the right atrium. So the coronary sinus, again, emptying blood into the right atrium, and what's forming it are those merging cardiac veins. So there's three different cardiac veins. We have the great, the middle, and the small cardiac vein. Again, you don't need to know these for lecture. This is really just here for lab. The great cardiac vein is anterior in your anterior interventricular sulcus, middles in your posterior interventricular sulcus, and your small cardiac vein is in your inferior margin. And there's a bunch of different anterior cardiac veins that are emptying directly into the right atrium as well. So I'm sure all of you have heard of a heart attack before. The more correct medical term for a heart attack is called a myocardial infarction. And what a myocardial infarction is the result of is actually blockage that has been prolonged in one of these coronary veins, so in your coronary circulation. So all of those branches and blood vessels I was just talking about, they're shown highlighted here for you. And again, this is predominantly for lab. And then again, you can see them in the whole heart picture.